Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center, and I am joining you tonight from Washington, D.C. We have a number of participants as well as our guest presenters, speakers on the panels today from Washington, D.C., North Carolina, later Korea, Indonesia, and of course the Philippines. So we're delighted that many of you are joining us, and some of you will watch this in a later recorded session. But we're pleased to invite you to this special program that launches two East-West Center in Washington reports. The first report and the first panel today is called American Public and Elite Opinion on Asia Matters for America. This is the second edition of our report in the series, done in collaboration with the University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center. And it seeks to gauge how American elites, meaning elected officials, public officials, business folk, as well as the general public, view U.S. relations with Asia in a number of areas ranging from climate change to trade, to employment, to investment, and social issues. And the idea of this is part of the East-West Center in Washington's Asia Matters for America series, which seeks to understand and highlight the way in which U.S.-Asia interactions grow, not only at the national level, but at the state and local levels. The second report we're launching tonight is the third in our series of reports around the U.S. elections. And this year's title is called Asia Navigates Uncertainty and Continuity of U.S. Regional Policy in the 2024 elections. And the idea of these reports is to take stock at the state of the U.S. debate and policy status of relations with Asia, and then to interact with our colleagues based in the region and ask them how they see current U.S.-Asia policy. So it's not specifically a report about how Asian attitudes about the U.S. elections per se, but rather U.S.-Asia policy on the eve of our elections. And both reports have turned up some very interesting findings. And I'm delighted to say we have an all-star cast of speakers, participants, experts from a range of perspectives, views, countries to share, who have read these reports, have looked at the findings, and are going to speak with us tonight. And the first one panel is on the poll report, as I mentioned. And this is the second one. We're joined tonight very happily by Dr. Laura Silver. She's the Associate Director of Global Attitudes at Pew. And as many of you know, Pew is a leader in public opinion on issues relating to foreign relations, not to mention domestic issues. So Dr. Laura Silver, thank you so much for joining us. We also have with us another expert on public opinion attitudes as part of his work in political science and political economy, and that's Dr. James Kim. He is the principal advisor to Anthologia and a lecturer in the Executive Master of Public Policy and Administration at Columbia University. He spent many years in Korea at the Asan Institute and knows Korea and the region also very well, not to mention public opinion and political economy issues in the United States. And not last but not at all least, we have our very good colleague, Kevin Monroe, Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, Office of the Governor of North Carolina. Kevin is, in some sense, an alumnus of the East-West Center, I'm happy to say. He joined us for our first inaugural congressional governor staff program on Asia and joined us with a field trip out to the region. North Carolina, as you know, has very extensive investment, trade, social, cultural ties with the region. And Kevin, we're delighted that you could join us today. And then we'll go to the second panel a little bit later at approximately 8:45. So let me start with the first panel. This is really an opening question to all of you. Ask each of you to maybe go in turn, starting with Dr. Laura Silver. So you've read the report, you've seen the findings, the second in a series, you may have compared the first. How do the findings in this report align with your own assessments, observations, experiences regarding U.S. perceptions of Asia? Are there any specific findings in this year's report that you found notable that you would like to highlight or call our attention to as we go forward? Dr. Silver, may I start with you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for sharing this incredibly interesting piece of work. We obviously do a lot of polls about American views of China as well as American views of foreign policy, but we don't have the elite perspective, which I found incredibly valuable. And one of the things consistently teased out throughout your report is that elites on, I think, every issue, if not close to every issue in this report, just see the impact of Asia in very different terms than the general public. Um, Quite regularly, it's significantly more positive. They seem to be more informed, as would be befitting of kind of the people working on this. Um, but one thing I found was interesting is even among elite, it wasn't always clear that there was a lot of differentiation among the items. For example, you asked a number of different ways that Asia could be important to people's states, whether it be the
Mm,
state of the economy in Asia or immigration. And by and large, kind of the distribution of this suggested that people either saw Asia as important on all of these things or on very few of them. And the same was relatively true of the general public. And that made me kind of curious about, is there something unique to elites that make them think foreign policy affects their day-to-day lives? And does the general public not see that? And who among the
mm,
general public does see that? Um,
mm,
One other thing I found particularly interesting actually is a question that you asked about job creation. So you
mm.
had an incredibly large share of Americans saying that they didn't know how many jobs kind of China has created in the United States. One thing I wondered about that was the framing of the question was about job creation.
Mm.
And we know from some other work that Americans often see trade in kind of a zero sum competitive framework. And I wondered if you had offered the possibility of job loss, if you would have had fewer people say that they didn't know, but it's really that the most of the general public probably doesn't think of China as a net job creator. And I found that kind of potentially an interesting explanation for why so few people were able to answer that question when many of the other questions that you had on the survey you didn't have similarly high don't know responses. But yeah, there was so much in here to dig into. I think it's a really great contribution.
Well, thank you, Dr. Silver. I really take that on board. I mean, framing that question as job loss would have been very interesting because it's such um, a sort of visible element of our debate about trade with anywhere, by the way, global trade, not just with Asia. Is should we be trading? Is trade good for us? Are tariffs better? Just today, there was a recent piece on how the left and right are coming together on sort of concerns and doubts about trade and the trade benefits. So really appreciate those insights and those comments, and especially also your comment about a differentiation about what makes Asia more important than another thing, because there's a sort of flatlining across issues, either think it's important or not on everything, and how to, as we redesign and nuance this study and going forward in the future, how we might try to get at differentiating what makes Asia important and where, because
Yeah.
one of the geographical differences was also key. Thank you. Let me turn to James. James, any thoughts, initial thoughts before we go to some specific questions?
Yeah, Satu, congratulations again on doing a second edition of this survey. As I've commented, when you launched the first version of this, I would echo Laura's point that adding the elite component here is it's very important, and I thought it was an important contribution. Secondly, I think working in coordination with NORC to do this with the kind of data set you have, which is fairly large, I thought was also very important. Just I want to add a little bit on to Laura's point about trade and how Americans see that. I think some of that was captured, though you didn't quite do it directly the way that I think Laura is suggesting when you asked about trade competitiveness, losing trade competitiveness, and you saw a large number of elites and the public both concerned about that issue with or without China, right? So 74 to 77% of the elites, 60 to 70% of the public, depending on whether China is in there or not in there. And I think that some of that is reflected. I also thought what was interesting was where you saw some key differences. I mean, and so that's one area where the elites seem to agree with the public. But
Mm,
some other areas, as Laura pointed out, elites had, how should I say, a more broad perspective and being more concerned about issues like democracy, climate change, human rights in comparison to the public. And this aligns well with other data that I'm seeing, in Chicago Council. You did mention that, I was affiliated with Columbia. I just recently also started working with an outfit called Korea Economic Institute of America. And we ran a survey in September of this year that looked at some of the similar issues focused largely on Asia. And what we found were a lot of similarities with what you found. A lot of, very American public in general, though we didn't survey the elites, obviously, but the public in general seemed to think that Asia is a very important region. Close to 60% seems to be saying that. 70% though support, the relationship that the U.S. has with the allies in the region. But the disparity that you saw between the elites and the public on these issues that doesn't have to do with regional security or trade, on things like, human rights and climate change, we saw, some differences there. But the way that we saw it as manifested in the way that the public saw it was that there were some partisan differences in how the different people aligned with different parties saw the importance of these issues. So Democrats tended to see these sort of non-traditional security areas on climate change, global health, human rights cooperation. They thought that these cooperation in these areas were important in Asia, but the Republicans didn't quite see it the same way. There were largely, there was a consensus, a broad consensus on regional security and trade, but on these issues, the difference was about 2-to-1, if not 3-to-1, on things like climate change, for instance, between the Republicans between the Democrats and the Republicans, and whether they thought that these issues were important issues in the region. So part of the reason why you might be seeing the public being less concerned may be due to the partisan differences on these issues and how they're positioning and how they see these issues.
James, thanks so much. That's fascinating. And that would be consistent with other polling of Americans on these issues and the Republican Democratic divide. So it seems that those divides in general, say on climate change or how important is democracy promotion, spill down or thread through, maybe the better way to put it, through regional. But what's important here for an organization such as the East-West Center, whose congressionally authorized mission is to promote U.S.-Asia relations by bringing Americans and Asians to do collaborative study, research, and exchanges. This has great bearing when the official government policy of the United States is to identify Asia as a key theater or region of interest. And if these bipartisan and other issues break down this way, it raises important questions of how to pursue a policy for a region that is identified as the focus, the regional focus of American interest. So really appreciate that input, James, and threading through the Korea work you're doing. We turn to Kevin. You're in a governor's office, you're in state government, you're kind of rubber beats the road on how people respond. Kevin, what are some of your opening thoughts?
First, a couple of 3 thank yous to you and the East-West Center. One, for allowing me to participate tonight, and 2, as you mentioned before, I'm an alum of the East-West Center, a proud alum now for the inaugural Governor Staff Program, and also the field trip that you all took to Raleigh back in March. And acknowledge another thank you. This is kind of blanket, but I will say that given recent events here in North Carolina, particularly with Helene and all the storm damage, the response and outreach from literally across the country and the world has been extraordinary, and want to specifically single out the government of Taiwan, which sent us a very generous gift for hurricane relief or storm relief of $300,000. So again, that has just been tremendous. As fate would have it, I'm in Charlotte. I'm based here in Charlotte, but we are actually hosting for the last 3 days the Southeastern U.S. Japan Conference. And just for the purposes of what the South means, it's a little smaller than the regional map you have in your report. It's North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama. At the opening yesterday, each delegate, Governor Cooper, or at least each delegation lead, opened with the importance of economics and trade and investment into their respective states. And that was across the board, all down the line. And one of the interesting things is, and I'll just single out North Carolina and Alabama as being competitors for automotive businesses. The presence here is, again, quite extraordinary. It's grown in a short amount of time. And I think that is going to actually help drive some of the numbers with the general public responses that you had gotten. We've had 3 major announcements in North Carolina regarding Japanese companies, actually Asian companies. VinFast, a electric automaker, is going to be building a facility in Chatham County. Toyota is building and expanding their battery manufacturing facility in Randolph and Gilbert County. And of course, Honda Jet has been in North Carolina for a while and expanded their engine manufacturing facility in Alamance County. I cite those 3 counties because they're all very, very, very rural. And one of the things I noted from, and thus conservative, and noting the partisan differences in some of your responses, they're all Republican. And trust me, again, it is a common denominator, and one thing that is the tie that binds the Democrats and Republicans here in North Carolina, that's economic and trade. One interesting thing along those lines too on sustainability, Japan Airlines did a presentation this morning along with Honda Jet, and one of the things they talked about was sustainability, particularly with jet fuels. So that was not only important to them there, but to the folks here in North Carolina. And going back to Toyota, and again, setting up in Randolph County, one of the key things there was sustainability and the importance protecting the environment to what was very prime and again, rural farmland. One other note along the national security lines, and actually 2 notes there. I took note of the National Guard programs. I think all but 2 states were Western states. I think it may have been Wisconsin and Rhode Island have joint programs with Pacific Islander or Pacific nations. Those programs are incredibly important. And North Carolina does not have any, but we do have a program with 4 African countries. We had them all here this past summer, and one of the interesting things was you would think it would have been very military focused, given that it was a military exchange, but they spent a good deal of their time focused on agricultural issues, visiting North Carolina State University, A&T University in Greensboro for engineering purposes. So those type exchanges go way, way, way beyond the military side of things. And one other item on the security side, I was surprised at the number between the elites and the general public about the agreement on the importance of cybersecurity. The bad actors here, or at least the bad actors abroad, China, Russia, and some of the African countries have hit us pretty hard. A lot of small, very rural towns have been hit by cyber attacks from Asian countries. So that is a very, very, very big deal. Bottom up, from the smallest counties, and Bladen County in eastern North Carolina was hit pretty hard by it. And an anecdotal note with that is that North Carolina is one of the few states in the country, maybe 4, I believe, that will not allow local governments to negotiate in terms of ransomware. If it's a ransomware attack, you cannot negotiate with your attacker. You have to go through state government to do that. So again, just a few initial observations, and again, great report.
I think you're muted.
I apologize. Thank you, Kevin. There was a lot of stuff there, and I want to get into some of it with all of you. I want to build back a little bit on and work backwards. You mentioned cybersecurity, and I'm astonished to hear about the small states and the prohibitions against negotiations on ransomware. So that's really quite interesting, because it has previously been argued that some of the vulnerabilities of farmers using, for example, Huawei and other tools is precisely because they have no options but to use Huawei that gives them the reach and the connectivity they need. So I'd like to learn more about that. But two specific questions on Asia. Is there a reason North Carolina's National Guard partnerships have not extended to Asia? Because as you know, many National Guard state partnerships are in Asia. And are there plans in North Carolina? And then on the broader question of the lack of divergence between Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, however you want to frame it on a partisan basis, that's quite powerful in North Carolina, it sounds to me like, given the investments in rural areas. And how does the government of North Carolina keep the enthusiasm for such commercial trade and investment ties going? Because one of the things we hear is, for example, on Japanese companies in North Carolina, many North Carolinians do not necessarily see them as Japanese companies. They see them as local companies, and that they're working for kind of, an arm of a U.S. company with an arm somewhere else, kind of. I wanted you to talk a little bit more about those two items, please.
Sure. Starting with the first, with the National Guard exchanges, I think it's just more proximity. One of the things you noted in your report was, the Western states, northwestern states, just in terms of travel, tourism, things along those lines. It's just proximity. There's no aversion, of course, to working with Asian countries in terms of National Guard exchange programs. And on the business side, the North Carolina, again, I will put on my Chamber of Commerce hat. For 2 years in a row, we were voted the best place to do business by CNBC. And the only reason we didn't get the third year, Virginia just beat us out just slightly. So that is something, it's a bragging right that, again, both parties strongly agree on. And depending on who you ask, one of the things we really tout is a workforce that's highly educated and a very, very robust and strong community college system that feeds into programs that Toyota and Honda Jet have. And to your point too, with those brand names right there, those are major players, of course. And as you noted, there are lots of smaller companies that, as you put it very well, that people think that's just more of a American subsidiary of a foreign country or a Japanese country, another Asian country, and don't necessarily associate that. But with it's a good thing. And what's happening now, it's because we're landing and are continuing to land the big fish. That's going to be less of a problem to have a country branded Vietnamese, Taiwanese, or any other Asian country.
Kevin, I want one follow up before I turn to Laura and James. In going out to Raleigh for the program that you joined us on Japan and Japan's sort of interactions with North Carolina, all the things you've been saying now, the findings of the report, our Asia Matters for America initiative, which maps by state and congressional district how Asia interacts with states and districts across the U.S. I want to ask a question. We're in a time where trade, even foreign direct investment inflows as well as outflows, are more contested. There's political dissonance about such matters on all sides of the spectrum, different ways, different levels, degrees. Can North Carolina, as a person in the state government, not speaking for the government necessarily, but how can North Carolina pursue what appeared to me from your intervention a very positive net outcome for the citizens, publics, and government of North Carolina in a national context where these things are more contested? Does that reduce the room for you to reach and make these connections? Or is it even more important that you do so on a state and sub-regional level, like you said, the southern states? How does that work operationally? I'm asking an operational question rather than sort of a policy prescription question.
Sure, it actually helps. One of the speakers this morning was Robert Kupke. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right.
Sure. Yeah, Robert Kupke.
Yeah. And one of the things he stressed was, the subnational diplomacy office and how important it is now for state and local governments to have their voices heard at the table of diplomacy, if you will. And
Yeah.
getting back to your original question too, I'll use a small town like Kannapolis, North Carolina. That is just outside of Charlotte. Now, 20 years ago, pretty much any sheet or any bedding that you had in your house came from Kannapolis, from Cannon Mills. Overnight, that company, I'm sorry, I was going to say overnight, that company shut down and the town was absolutely decimated. Not quite destroyed, but to your getting into your point of local governments feeling empowered. Kannapolis was on one of the tours that we did with the delegations here for SUSE Japan, and they specifically went to the research center there at the old site of Politex. They literally raised the facility, and it has one of the best research campuses on it specifically deals with nutrition and public health. But again, it's a town that reinvented itself. So again, the importance of being empowered to do that is key.
Yeah, that's very, very insightful. And I appreciate that, because sometimes sitting in Washington, we don't get how it works. And the example of the town and its ability to revive itself through those linkages is kind of a living example of what we talk about, US-Asia interactions and the way to maintain them and grow them and build them. So thank you. Let me turn to James and Laura a little bit here, because both of you are starting out looking in your respective work and your organizations on sort of big macro issues, polling data and stuff. And I have a couple of questions. One, James, you've been doing a lot of work at Korea Economic Institute. In the wake of the IRA, Korea has become a major, I mean, it was prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, but even more so, has pumped in a lot of money into the United States, into green technologies over the last couple of years. We flagged this in our election report as well. But Korea has also been subject to considerable criticism on the trade front and on the investment front, less so. And I would like to ask you, given these views, given the views of the importance of trade, and the partisan differences that you flagged about so-called non-traditional issues, how will the new political environment in the United States, which appears to favor a consensus against trade and more selective investment, affect forward movement on this deep US-Asia economic engagement? And for Laura, in the same vein, Pew has done so much polling on top-ranked issues, and I've been trying to follow the best as I can as a non-professional, the views on various issues. I must tell you that international trade and those commercial issues rank pretty lower down from inflation, grocery prices, all the issues you can imagine. How do can we connect the two? Because after all, whether you choose tariffs, whether you choose to go into trade deals, has bearing on what costs we pay as consumers, whether it be at the grocery store or at the clothing store or what have you. How do we understand that relationship, and how do we get at it, and where Asia plays a role in that relationship? So maybe start with James and then go to Laura.
So when I take a look at, as I've said before, and I think your data also shows this, trade issues for the general public, it seems to me outside of Washington with, these the major political parties and the respective positions on this issue, trade with Asia generally seems to be favorable. At least it's bipartisan in the way that we're seeing it in our data set. Now, if you bring in China to the equation, it could be a little different. But trade with countries like South Korea, with Japan, largely there doesn't seem to be a big problem with this. Investment, it seems to me there's some differences. Like, for instance, your data seems to show that depending on whether the elites, even if they know and they know Asia versus those that do not, there are different views about how important inbound investment from Asia is in these respective groups, right? I see about 2-to-1 difference, right, in what you're seeing. And so one of the works that East-West Center is doing is reaching out to these local state level officials to kind of get them acclimated on and to see Asia and to really see it for what it is. I think that's a big contribution you're making, aside from reports like this one. Let me answer it this way. What implication does this have? I think there are two things that we're seeing as we engage at the state level, and this is from a colleague who took a trip to South Carolina, and it's an anecdote. He met with a Secretary of Commerce at the state of South Carolina, just south of North Carolina. And he was talking about how it's great to have Korean investments on EVs. And the justification was not on the basis of the impact on climate change, but it was on the superiority of the technology. So here's an argument that's being made by an official from red state that seems to suggest that there are certain benefits to be had from things like IRA and investments on renewable side of the equation, sectors of the economy. And he's saying that there's an economic, technological rationale for why that investment is a good thing. So just because there are different views on this doesn't necessarily mean that they're against trade and investment relations with Asia, number one. Number two, I was at the IMF annual meeting last week, participating in some of the meetings, and this is one of the big questions, right? How do you adjust in an environment where trade no longer is leading growth, but growth is going to be leading whether or not you're going to be having a trade relationship, and what kind of trade relationship that is? And the answer that I think IMF gave was that we need to figure out how to get growth going through structural reforms, and we need to figure out how to do that outside of this boundary of thinking about this in terms of trade. That growth needs to be done in some other way through structural reforms and done in a fiscally responsible way. And every country needs to figure out how to do that before countries are comfortable enough to then, really engage in trade that is unrestricted and free.
Thank you, James, very much. And I really appreciated your comments. And I do, since we're talking now, a delegation from my team in Washington is on their way to Iowa to participate in a U.S.-Japan agricultural dialogue on the sidelines of the Borlaug dialogue. Just an example. And last week we were in Minneapolis, Minnesota, talking about the U.S.-Japan relationship in Minnesota as we talked about it in North Carolina with Kevin and colleagues a few months ago. So the East-West Center in Washington is very heavily engaged in doing outreach across the United States to work and cooperate with many people who have interest in the U.S.-Asia relationship. Laura, can we turn to you about this mega question?
Yeah.
How do we put Asia in the thread between these big macro issues on commerce and understanding how it impacts on U.S.-Asia?
It's such a great question, but it presumes Americans know a lot more about trade than, unfortunately, I think the data bears out. So obviously, if you ask the elites or if you ask people on this call, trade should lower prices. Trade should allow people to specialize. Americans don't view trade that way. So there's a lot of great political science literature, some of it being written by Diana Mutt at the University of Pennsylvania. She has a whole book about American attitudes towards trade. But most Americans have a zero-sum notion of trade. For example, if you ask Americans whether or not we benefit more than other countries, they often see other countries benefiting more than we do. And that's particularly the case when it comes to China. In fact, there's some relatively solid evidence that Americans would rather not create any jobs in the United States if it means more jobs are created in a country that Americans don't like. So even if we get one, if they get two, that's seen as losing, which is obviously completely counter to what we would think as economists, the entire notion of specialization that we all learn about with Pareto optimality. That is just not how Americans think. So when you ask, like, people are concerned about inflation, they're concerned about other kind of bread and butter issues. That's absolutely true. But they don't necessarily see trade as lowering prices and benefiting them economically. And in fact, this is particularly the case with China, but it can be kind of generalized more to how people see trade. It's kind of seen through a competitive lens. And unfortunately, it's also usually seen through some sort of ethnocentrism. So people who are generally more hostile to foreign countries or more likely to kind of place the US in the center, they are more hostile to trade. So you asked such a good question, but it presumes that Americans know more about trade and have a more informed policy than they actually typically do.
This is dangerous terrain, Laura, but your comments really inspire me to sort of ask an edgy question about whether trade is part of our sort of this contested notion in our DNA. On the one hand, America has been wildly successful in part because of its ability to gain from international trade, right? On many fronts, our markets, but also to be able to produce elsewhere, et cetera. And yet trade politically throughout our history, whether you call the great sucking sound of NAFTA to third-party candidates to just in the last, well, dozen years, how trade has been contested in US elections, the Trans-Pacific Partnership fiasco. Trade appears to be very contested cyclically in American elections and tends to become an issue far greater. On the one hand, it's such a big issue and important to our economy, but its relative share to our GDP is quite small. I mean, we're not 100% export dependent or even highly trade dependent compared to many, many countries. How does one explain this? Well, very paradoxical to me anyway. We have this great dissonance over trade politically. It manifests itself in third-party candidates, opposition to major negotiated agreements, but it's a relatively small share of our GDP. It now stands at give or take $24 trillion a year. Why? What happens? What's the discontinuity here from a country that has largely benefited from globalization?
Well, excuse me. One thing I can say is that not all trade partners are seen equivalently. So when it comes to trade with China, Americans see America losing. When it comes to trade with Canada, we did kind of a random experiment to see whether or not people were just generally opposed to trade or if they're just opposed to trade with certain partners. When it comes to Canada, people see us benefiting equally. They do not see the US benefiting more than Canada, but they do see us benefiting equally. So some of this has to do with where we're positioned geopolitically. And I think some of that comes through in your survey, where there is concern about losing competitiveness. This is a really salient thing in an election time, especially where you see like Martha Blackburn smashing China plates, right?
Right.
China in particular is seen as a competitor. And so when it comes to trade with China, we are seen as losing. Whether or not the economics bear that out, that is how kind of our data suggests that Americans feel. I think it's interesting that there probably is some nuance that Americans may feel more positively about trade with other Asian countries. I haven't looked at that, but I think James was suggesting that some of that might be the case. Generally, Americans are much more positive towards Korea and towards Japan and towards Taiwan. So I imagine they're more positive about trade. That said, trade as an issue, I do think because of how it's talked about in American elections, probably connotes some level of competition and connotes some level of China to people, at least right now. That's what's kind of salient, I would say, in the media landscape.
Fascinating. Thank you. Well, we are at approximately just a few minutes before, and there is one Q&A that I'd like to get to, but I do want to give James and Kevin one last thing, and then we'll go to Q&A and then close out this panel on the poll report. And I know we welcome all of you, panelists to stay on, but we will turn now to the election report and sort of the assessment from our colleagues in Asia and Dr. Robert Sutter. But I do want to ask James, Korea has generally been seen as an ally. Very high approval ratings for the alliance, both countries. The trade relationship has not been particularly contested. As a large Japan, we only have 4 trade agreements in Asia, with Korea, with Singapore, with Australia, And I'm missing one, James, you'll remind me. I believe there are four, maybe there are only three. But anyway, Korea is certainly the largest top 10 world economy with whom we have a free trade agreement. How are you seeing that attitude? How are you seeing it relative to other countries? So Laura made the point that generally positive views of Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, which are clearly seen. We have no issues with Australia because even though they run a small surplus, not a real big issue. And then same question to Kevin. Do you find dissonance in North Carolina, let's say, this positive view of commercial relations, investment, trade, et cetera, with Asia? Would it differ, as Laura suggests, if China was brought into the equation? So maybe ask you those questions, and then we'll go to our comment in the Q&A. James?
So I think Laura's right when you compare how Americans view trade relative to other issues. But if you look at trade, I think across different countries, and I think Laura really, pointed that out. That's at least what we found in our survey in September. And we have a report that you can find online on KEI's website. But essentially, what I found very, very interesting is that there are partisan differences about how different Americans see regions and countries. For instance, Europe, there are big differences, about 20-point difference between Republicans and Democrats about whether they see that region as a critical partner or an adversary, as crazy as that sounds.
Wow.
Ukraine is another one. And then Mexico is a third one. That there was a 10-point difference in Mexico. But interestingly, when you look at Israel, no difference. Korea, very little difference, if any, and same with Japan, and all over close to 60% and up. And so, when you try to look at these studies, and I think, Laura was saying that there's some ethnocentric component that might be driving this. And those cues are what's determining. I've seen some research on foreign direct investment that it says exactly that, right? And I think I would assume that trade is similar. And I've done similar kinds of surveys in Korea, and I saw similar differences in Korea among Koreans about how they saw free trade with other countries, depending on how they saw those countries.
Interesting.
It's not based on an economic analysis, a nuanced economic analysis, as you're suggesting, Satu, but certain kinds of cues that are priming these individuals to think in a particular way about trade. And that it gets into an interesting question, and we're thinking about digging more deeply into those issues on future analysis. So you raise a very important point from an analytical point of view, and also from a policy standpoint.
Fascinating. And I'm sorry to be so materialistic, I guess, to think in very logical econometric and gains and losses terms. But you're right. There are these other intervening variables that, clearly shape attitudes. And both you and Laura have pointed them out with great effect and with great salience. So thank you. Kevin, here you are in North Carolina talking about how important commerce is, both parties, rural areas, urban areas, across the state. Does it change when you bring in a controversial actor such as China, or, for example, other players perhaps? Or
Yes. Right before I came over this afternoon, I saw an article online from one of the city business journals, and I'm not sure which city, but the title of it was North Carolina businesses have walk a fine line when it comes to China. Again, that was published sometime today, and I should have pulled it up and read it. Specifically with rural areas, again, another fine line, because tobacco, of course, used to be king here. And I'm almost sure of this, but China is probably one of the largest markets, if not largest, the largest for North Carolina tobacco. And again, that's way rural, way conservative. And yes, if you had to stick a party label on it, certainly Republican. So yes, so that's gets to that fine line that the article, at least the title of it, alluded to.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Let me turn to our Q&A and treat it with care, because we have asked for, and this doesn't appear to be a question. There is no question mark punctuation at the end, but It simply says oldest and consistent U.S. foreign trade policy since early 19th century has been open door policy of open markets into other nations. And I gather from this comment that we have not only welcomed in some respects trade and investment into our country, but we have sought to open markets as we clearly did in many, many other countries. From the three panelists, from your different perspectives, is that era over? Are we going to be worried? Are we going to be in the business of opening markets in the future? Or is there going to be a much more, if you will, internal inward focus? I call it insulationism, not isolationism, where you insulate against a sort of a protective filter. What do you think? Are we entering an era where there's more consensus around, we don't care if those markets are open or not. We will privilege close partners, whether ethnocentric or alliance partners or however the framing device is, to come into our country and invest here. And even then, as we've discovered in the case of Nippon Steel and US Steel, not without dissonance. What do you think? Give us your forward guesses here, 10 days out from a momentous election. Who's starting?
I thought you weren't going to ask us to make predictions, or even if you did, I was going to refrain from doing so and say we don't know what the results are going to be next week. So, I think I'm going to basically say that I'm an optimistic guy. Yes, some transition seems to be happening here, but history is about what happened in the past, not about the future. So I think we make our future, and I'll just leave it at that, and say leave it to the rest of the panelists to fill in.
Great. What are you seeing, Kevin, down at the state level there? I mean, is there still on both sides we're hearing things about trade and investment. So, how will North Carolina navigate that?
Again, I hesitate to use the term now fine line, and I'll reference to the robust and incredibly strong bipartisanship when it comes to trade and economics from both sides, and again using our state legislature and the governor's office, of course, opposite parties. But again, the common denominator with everything right now, foreign direct investment, trade, economics across the board. So I will say from don't want to be partisan, but at least from a Democratic side, and we just want to look towards the positive.
Thank you.
Sure.
Laura, you have the last word on these big meta issues facing America on trade with Asia, investment with Asia, and in general.
Yeah, I think in part because the American public's views of trade are not necessarily those of an economist. They can probably be malleable depending on how elites are messaging about trade. So I don't think we need to assume the worst. We just need to recognize that Americans are going to follow the lead on complicated issues of the people that they trust. And so American opinion will likely be guided by the foreign policy and kind of messaging of whoever is in office next.
Thank you. Well, what a terrific panel. I want to thank Dr. Laura Silver, Dr. James Kim, and our colleague in the North Carolina State Government, Kevin Monroe, for your really insightful, grounded, and thoughtful remarks on our polling report. If you haven't gotten a chance to get our polling report, please go online to the East-West Center and look for the American Public and Elite Opinion on Asia Matters for America. It will be easily accessible, and compare it with the first edition if you'd like, but has some great data, great charts to look at. And I again want to thank Dr. Silver, Dr. Kim, and Dr. Monroe for their insights into this report. Of course, you're welcome to join us, but I would like to now turn to our second report of this program today, which is how regional countries and experts view the state of U.S.-Asia policy on the eve of our 2024 national elections. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, let me turn to that now, and we have online some very distinguished speakers as we had in the previous panel, and we are joined for the for the report on U.S. elections and Asia policy by Dr. Robert Sutter, Professor of Practice of International Affairs, George Washington University, one of the co-authors of the report, along with Dr. Nicholas Hamasevich and myself. We are also joined by Dr. Chungyin Moon. He is a special advisor to President Moon Jae-in, and he is also affiliated and a professor at Yonsei University and the journal Global Asia of the East Asia Foundation. Thank you so much, Chungyin, for joining us today. We are also joined online by Dr. Devi Fortuna Anwar. Dr. Devi Fortuna Anwar is a research professional, professor, National Research and Innovation Agency in Indonesia, one of our interviewees for this report. Thank you so much, Devi, for joining us. And not last but not at all least, our good friend, colleague, alumnus of the East-West Center also through our visiting fellow program, Dr. Renato Cruz de Castro. He's a distinguished professor in Manila at De La Salle University. Great to have you with us, and thank you so much, not only for your input during the writing and making of the report on the elections and Asia policy, but for joining us this morning, your time in Asia, for this report. What I'd like to do for this panel is to start with Dr. Robert Sutter, who has been a faithful partner in the last 3 editions of this report and is going to lay out the basics of what the U.S., how Asia came up in the U.S. elections this year, and then some basic comments on some of the countries who can't be represented this evening on our panel. And then we'll go to each of you to talk about Korea, Philippines, and Indonesia on some of your takeaways from the report and from your country's perspectives. And then we'll engage in some Q&A discussion until we close. If that's okay by everyone, let me invite Dr. Robert Sutter first, please, to make some introductory and opening comments on this report. Bob?
Thanks very much, Satu. It's really a pleasure for me to be with everybody today. It's been a real honor to be part of this project and work with Satu and his colleagues so closely. It's been great. I'm going to provide some key points about the election in the United States that deal with Asia, and then I'll talk about a couple of general points about regional reaction and look at a few particular countries. First, the U.S. side. Foreign policy is obviously secondary. It's very second in this campaign. Asian issues are almost non-existent except for China. And there are many differences between the Biden and Harris team and the Trump team on China issues, but there are 2 big ones. One is how you deal with allies and partners, and that's pretty clear. Biden and Harris value them greatly, and Mr. Trump is more America first in his orientation and gives that allies and partners a much lower priority. And the second is a matter of degree, and this is protectionism, viewed from the region at least, in tariffs. And Mr. Trump obviously has much bigger plans for tariffs than the Biden-Harris team. But overall, this was not there was not a serious debate about China in the election in the United States. There was no partisan debate at all. Well, very little of that. And so that's a feature to keep in mind. And keep in mind the Democratic platform has 10 big elements, and foreign policy is last. It's the last element. And Trump's platform mentions China 3 times. Doesn't even mention Taiwan. It's not. So it's not. It's hard to put all these together. But I think what you find is that there are differences over China and not much else in Asia. But the regional reactions are serious. There was no one that said anything nice about these elections, positive things that were coming out of them. It was all negative. It was all dealing with negatives, and there was a great deal of sense of uncertainty about, and the elections were adding to this sense of uncertainty among the people we talked with, and considerable angst on the part of some people about the situation. And the things that they were anxious about included growing protectionist practices, challenging globalization, the conflicting pressures they're under vis-a-vis the United States and China rivalry, strong domestic opposition in many of these countries to the leaders and what they're doing with the United States and China. And then underlying a lot of it was a growing sense that U.S. resolve to be the leader of Asia was in decline. And the Trump election and what Trump stood for was seen as emblematic of that. And then we look at specific cases. Taiwan. Taiwan was the most anxious. They're on the front line with China. They rely heavily on the United States. They don't have a lot of leverage over the United States. And so they're anxious about this situation because they think that while Harris they prefer Harris, but they view Harris as having shortcomings, but they prefer Harris. And Trump would seem somebody that would be very disruptive for them on the tariff side. And also they have this sense of worry about a deal that Trump would make with China that would disadvantage them. And so and the government faces a strong opposition that disagrees with the way they're dealing with the United States and China. They're too friendly to the United States and too harsh on China in the view of the opposition. In Japan, they also are on the front lines, but they're much less anxious than we found in Taiwan. They're more concerned about Trump than Harris for similar reasons, the tariffs and so forth. But they're relatively confident they can handle Trump. They felt they handled Trump pretty well in the first Trump administration, and that if he gets elected, they could handle him fairly well. They, though, also raised this issue of the long-term resolve of the United States. And what these debates in the United States, the direction is uncertain. You're debating fundamental issues, and they depend on American interaction with Asia in a constructive way for them. And then there's China, and China is not anxious. They're not anxious, but they're very negative about the situation. Well, they're negative, and they don't like either candidate. They have no preference, but there'll be no compromises. And so the upshot of this is that they're getting ready for both. Whichever one wins, they're prepared to deal with them appropriately. And yet their recent stress on stability suggests in the comments that they have an implicit preference for Harris. At this point, they worry about the disruption that Donald Trump could cause with 60% tariffs and this type of thing. And so they worry about that. Harris will be more incremental. They don't like either one. They worry about the long-term consequences with the Biden-Harris approach, but they have this feeling. When they get into the issue of long-term, say this is actually working to their advantage. The U.S. is gradually disengaging from Asia, and China's rise will then be less encumbered as they move along. India is not particularly anxious. Modi is very consistent with his stance in 2016 and 2020. He avoids taking a side in the elections. He welcomes the strong U.S. ties as a counterweight to China's rise, but he pursues his balancing act in sustaining Russian ties, working cooperatively with the BRICS, and pursuing whatever opportunities comes with Chinese willingness to be flexible on the border areas. Australia, they like Harris, and they're not really worried about Trump because they had a very good record in dealing with Trump in the first term. They don't have a trade surplus with the United States. They have a big trade deficit with the United States. That's one element. But they, too, are worried about what the debate in the United States over America First versus international interaction means for them. They depend on the United States being active internationally, and they worry about the long-term trend. So this sums up in a very brief way and gives more time to our speakers from Asia, the situation in those particular places and an overall view of our report. So Satu, back to you.
Well, thank you so much. And also take this opportunity online to say a sincere thank you for joining not only in this report, but the 2016 and 2020 versions, and providing this continuity and this expertise to our effort along this year with Nicholas Hamasevich, as I mentioned. And now I have the great pleasure to turn to our panelists from Asia. all three of them with whom we consulted in the making of this particular edition of the report. And I'll start per the order on the program with Professor Cheng-In Moon, followed by Dr. Devi Fortuna Anwar, and then Dr. Renato De Castro. Cheng-In, thanks so much joining us the next morning there in Korea. I believe you're in Korea. So let's have your comments on not only what Bob said, but what the report says, and particularly from a Korean vantage point, where we found some of the divides and contestations domestically to play into how Koreans saw the current state of U.S.-Asia policy on the eve of elections. Over to you.
I found that your report on South Korea is extremely well balanced. Most of American reports cover views from conservatives, but your report reflected a lot of voices from the progressive too. As you noted, Korea is as divided as the United States in terms of ideological spectrum between right and left. And the current Yoon Suk-yeol government is very conservative, championing alliance with the United States and trilateral cooperation with Japan and the United States, and also taking very hardline policy on North Korea. But on the contrary, the progressive camp in South Korea, in fact, the Democratic Party of Korea has a majority seat in the National Assembly. Therefore, they have legislative check and balance against the Yoon Suk-yeol government. They have some, they want to pursue more balanced diplomacy. They want to, despite all these setbacks, they want to have a more engagement with North Korea. And they want to have some kind of strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the United States. Therefore, there are two different camps. But I think that your report reflected all those dimensions. But now we don't see any big problem with if Harris get reelected. We'll see the continuity of policy from the Biden administration. Therefore, U.S. will be much more predictable. But problem is Trump. But ironically, the conservative in South Korea used to align themselves with Republican Party in the United States. But there is a great expectation that the Yoon government will have a hard time with President Trump, because President Trump has been saying that I'll have a talk with Kim Jong-un. I will, fix the problem. Okay, which the Yoon Suk-yeol government doesn't want. Okay, another big issue, we are paying about $1 billion in our defense cost for American forces stationed in South Korea. Now Trump is saying that too little. South Korea is a money machine. We should increase to at least $10 billion. That will create enormous domestic repercussion in South Korea. In fact, the Yoon government expedited the renewal negotiation of this defense cost sharing with the United States just a week ago. But if Trump get reelected, he will come up with that idea again. A lot of people saying that ROK US FTA free trade arrangement will be okay, but given current trade surpluses which South Korea is enjoying vis-a-vis the United States, it is very unlikely that Mr. Trump would would go pass by, would pass by. Therefore, he will raise that issue. But of course, we have made humongous, almost $100 billion investment in the United States. Okay, the automobiles and the electric batteries and whatever. Therefore, we have a huge deficit in investment, but President Trump doesn't see that deficit, our deficit in investment, and he's just looking at about $40 billion trade deficit. That would be another big issue. Therefore, in other words, for progress in South Korea, they are hoping that if Trump can make a big deal with Kim Jong-un, then we might have a new momentum for denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and creating peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. That's a positive side. Okay, but in other areas, we expect some kinds of conflict with the United States. Therefore, opposition party has been arguing that we should prepare for it. But for the Yoon Suk-yeol government, it will be a curse if Trump implement American foreign policy as he has been telling during the campaign, and that will be a really curse to the Yoon Suk-yeol government. There's yet to be seen. But one thing is clear, as Professor Sutter pointed out, the overall sentiment in South Korea is not favorable vis-a-vis American presidency election. Even there is a lot of, in fact, I have to go to the live TV show after this. But their concern is this: will Trump accept the election result? Any smooth transition? That is one of the big topics in South Korea. Therefore, we have some kind of doubt on American democracy. That's a very sad aspect of current ROK-US relations. You used to be the shining chapel on the hill, but all of a sudden, American democracy is in trouble. Very pitiful development. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Chung-In, and we have lots to pick up on, and I want to come back to all of the panelists on a couple of broader themes, because we can get into countries, of course, but some broader themes. But really appreciate you setting it off. And in fact, you might check out the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which tends to be quite conservative, but had a very interesting remark about the insights into what they understand to be potential deals on North Korea if the Trump administration, a new Trump administration were to be elected. Let me turn to Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar from Indonesia there. Just inaugurated your president, Mr. Prabowo is now president in place. Very much a big transition, not beyond a transition now to democracy. I think it's the fourth general election and transition. Can you say a little bit more about Indonesia's perspectives in the report, when we had the good fortune of talking to you along the way as we prepared this report? Over to you, Devi.
Well, thank you very much, Satu and Bob. Congratulations on the report. I read it from cover to cover, and I think that you have really captured the essence. I know you talk with lots and lots of people, but I really enjoyed reading the report. Particularly in Indonesia, I think you've got it. The fact that Indonesians in general do not pay too much attention to what is happening, not just in the United States, but out and other part of the world, except what's happening in Gaza. Because everyone is so focused on our own transition from President Joko Widodo to President Prabowo. For days on end, people were, the newspapers mostly filled with who would be appointed as ministers and vice ministers, and what the composition of the cabinet would be, and what the priorities would be. So I'm sorry, just like in any big country, foreign policy is not a major issue. But there's one thing that, for Indonesia, and this is how, unfortunately, most Indonesians look at the United States, is that the Palestinian issue is very much central. It was central during the presidential campaign. During the inauguration of the President Prabowo, the parliamentary hall, the chair of the Consultative Assembly, in his introduction, talked at length about politics, democracies, and all the challenges that Indonesia faced. But he called on the Indonesian government to help resolve the Palestinian issue. I expect that Indonesia will continue to fight for the right of Palestinians for their statehood. And in his presidential acceptance speech, President Prabowo spent about 3/4 of his talks about how to deal with Indonesian domestic problems, like poverty, energy security, food security, and so on and so forth. And then again on the Palestinian issue. Therefore, when Indonesians, both at the elite level, but also at the wider public, think about the United States, it is seen about what the US does and does not do to resolve the conflicts in Gaza. So that's very much the perception of the United States at the moment. So I think we need to understand that. So the United States is a global actor, and how it has acted to the in relation with the Muslim world, particularly now, allowing the genocide and the violations of international human rights law to go unpunished the continuing unstinting support with Israel, whether it is the Democratic Party or whether it's the Republican Party. Although the optic, the behavior, the sounds made by the Democratic sounded much more supportive, of the settlement of the Palestinian issue than say the Republican Party. So at the global level, the United States will always be judged not just by what it does in relation to Indonesia-US relations. Secondly, on the Indo-Pacific issue, the US is seen in the perspective of what it does, particularly in relation to the US-China rivalry. But what Indonesia does with China is not really seen as what it has nothing to do with what the US does. Whether Indonesia push ships, the Chinese ships coming to Indonesian waters, that's Indonesian business. It's nobody else's business. So it's not seen as whether we are supporting the US freedom of navigation. It's nothing to do with that. This is Indonesia ensuring the rights of its own sovereign rights against external incursions in this EEZ. So it's not seen as part of the US-China rivalry at all. And then at the bilateral level, I think that there's no the desire, as you mentioned in your paper, is that Indonesia welcomes closer relationship with the United States, a much more holistic relationship. It's not just too much focus on security, which is robust, but also more economic relationship, more continuing general system of preferences, support for maybe a critical mineral agreement, and then U.S. support for Indonesia's application for OECD. So you can say that the public is less concerned about that. For the public, it's just about Palestinian issue. But for their policymakers, they are concerned about the details of the relationship. But also on the whole, you've got it right that the U.S. election is of secondary interest to Indonesia at the moment, or anybody says elections, because everything is so focused on this first 100 days of the Prabowo government.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dewi. I mean, two particular points is just a reminder that Indonesia has, just inaugurated a new president, is doing this transition. How will it flow? All the new ministers. So very much steeped in a kind of inward gaze right now. And so the US election doesn't refract so much. How global US policy refracts in Indonesia. And the very interesting line about even the Natuna issues don't refract so much at part of the US-China as much as Indonesia's national policy, which is interesting because for some in the US, naturally the China-Indonesia differences on Natuna and the zone, et cetera, are seen as perhaps a point of convergence or a point of building a forward-looking, more substantive US-Indonesia military or at least maritime or even Navy or Coast Guard partnership. So I think we can get to that, but really appreciate your comments as always, your insights as always. Let me turn now to another country that we found and flagged in our report along with South Korea and Taiwan as one of the three countries, very close US longstanding alliance partner, but also has very divided politics. I think it's, Renato, it's fair to say right now between the camps in Manila and elsewhere in the country, but has grave questions, concerns, not only internally, but also about the relationship with the US. Do you want to talk to some of those issues, Renato?
Hey, nice to see you again, Satu, and it's great
Great.
seeing familiar faces, Robert. And Dewi, we were just together with Dewi at Vietnam. So
Okay.
again, let me start, of course, what's happening here in the Philippines. Actually, there's, of course, given the fact that there's a recognition of Chinese maritime expansion during the time of the late President Benigno Aquino III, then, of course, the failure of the Duterte administration appeasement policy. So this is becoming apparent. Yes, you have division here, but it seems that the current administration is simply unraveling all the legacies of the previous administration, extrajudicial killings, a sense of impunity, and more importantly, the appeasement policy of the Duterte administration has been simply turned upside down. Now, of course, you have a strong sense that China is the quintessential threat to Philippine national security. That is, of course, very apparent in government documents. The fact that you have read the national security policy of the current administration, it's not anymore domestic, it's already external. And of course, right now I'm working on I would call the first grand strategy of the Philippines, which is called the archipelagic defense concept, which basically declares that China's maritime expansion is a threat, and of course, the transparency initiative of the Philippine government and the strong position taken by President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. during ASEAN Forum. You know, when he in Indonesia basically attacked China, and of course during the ASEAN China summit in the last ASEAN meeting in Laos, again he raised the issue of China. So your report basically captured the very essence of the fact that yes, you have vision, but of course you also have the galvanization of public opinion and of course government efforts to address what we consider, of course, as Chinese maritime expansion. I read the part of your report about the sense of anxiety here in Manila, based again probably on the the analysts you probably interview. I guess I'm not one of them. I don't share that concern because going back, of course, I could still remember the Trump administration. The Trump administration actually saved the alliance. You know, when he was able to befriend Rodrigo Duterte, he was in a process of course, gravitating towards China. You know, when he visited Manila in 2012 and befriend Rodrigo Duterte, that saved the alliance. And of course, when the Trump administration, despite the Duterte's effort for peace, China provided military equipment during the siege of Marawi, and of course, when he came to Manila in November 2012. Then, of course, former Secretary Pompeo was coming here, basically assuring us that, of course, the Mutual Defense Treaty will be honored by the United States. What is perceived here, and I basically perceive, in fact, is you have continuity in terms of U.S. foreign policy in the region, in terms, of course, of engaging China in a strategic competition, which, of course, began during the Trump administration. And, of course, I could still remember this during the confirmation of Secretary Antony Blinken. The best thing that the Trump administration did is engage China in a strategic competition. And of course, by engaging China in strategic competition, you have, of course, the revitalization of the alliance. And of course, nothing bad happened during the Biden administration. It went well. There might be a concern probably that there might be a change, but from my personal take, I don't think so. There'll be a bipartisan consensus in terms of engaging China in a strategic competition. There'll be a bipartisan consensus in continuing the alliance between the Philippines and the United States, enhancing the enhanced defense cooperation side, assisting the Philippines in terms of modernizing its military capability, supporting the Philippines in terms, of course, of building up the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept. My concern as an academic, as an analyst, is just in case former President Trump would win, would be what happened in Europe. If he would cut a deal, he will try to cut a deal with Russia, which would, of course, also affect NATO and Europe's countries' effort to be present here. This might create a problem. I don't see President Trump cutting a deal with China. He could try to, but whether Xi Jinping, given the fact that the degree of competition has become so intense, and the fact that, of course, Russia is actively supporting China here in this part of the world. So this is basically my take. Whether it will be Trump of Kamala Harris, it will be business as usual in terms of engaging China in strategic competition and, of course, enhancing the Philippine-U.S. alliance. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Renato. That was really helpful, and I'm sorry I misidentified you. I recall that we were trying to see you in Manila, but I think we missed you. But glad to see that you were in Washington recently, and of course, I'll see you next week in Manila as well. So looking forward to that. But your comments not only are useful for your observations and insights into the Philippines-U.S. relationship, but one of the three questions I had for all of the four panelists here today, because we have limited time. We have about 12 minutes before the program comes to a close while we await some Q&A from online participants. And that one question is continuity. Because our report is called, I remind viewers, listeners, that our report this year, last year, 2020, was called the Asia Responds, something to the effect, Asia Responds to the Hardening U.S.-China Strategic Competition. This year is called Asia Navigates Uncertainty and Continuity of U.S. Regional Policy in the 2024 elections. So I want to talk a little bit about continuities. And I know that Chung Yin has to leave for a live TV program, as he mentioned, about the U.S. elections as it happens. So maybe we could start with him. what continuities do you foresee? We've heard about Philippines. The Quad has been a continuity. The hardening of US-China competition has been a continuity. The drift towards less interest in free trade agreements and globalization has been a continuity. Alliance improvements have been continuity, and we've just had this rather, quite surprising election result in Japan, which came up in our election report as not being particularly concerned and not particularly fractured domestic politics. But here we have a result which is, somewhat astounding in terms of what it might mean. So Cheng-In, do you have some thoughts on the issue of continuity in US policy? We know the differences. You've highlighted some of them.
I agree with Renato's observation. In Europe, if Trump get reelected, there might be a profound change. But even for Trump, there will be no big change in Asia, and because China will continue to remain major challenge, and the United States will continue to pursue the strategy of encirclement containment, and then even Trump will be pushing for the coalition of like-minded countries in this part of the world. Therefore, I don't see any major structural changes in American strategy on Asia. But there might be major change in Europe. For example, Ukraine war, as Trump used to say that he may end the Ukraine war within a week after he get it inaugurated. I don't know, but if he makes a deal with Putin, then that will create totally new landscape in Europe. But in Asia, I really don't think any big changes. But North Korea, because as Satu pointed out, today's Wall Street Journal editorial made it very clear. Trump is saying that I can talk with all the autocratic leader, okay, and he resumed talk with North Korean leader, and in order to have any meaningful talk with North Korea, then Trump had to recognize North Korea's nuclear weapon state. The South Koreans will oppose that idea. Japanese will oppose that idea. Therefore, there will be major friction between Washington and Seoul and Tokyo. Okay. Therefore, Trump's so-called assertive approach of North Korea for any negotiated settlement can create a major friction with Tokyo and Seoul. Okay. And also that will create enormous domestic division in South Korea. The progressives in South Korea will welcome that idea. Okay. Conservative will deadly oppose that idea. That is your point. Therefore, to sum it up, yes, we don't see any problem with Harris. Kamala Harris will continue, as Biden does, whole coalition of like-minded countries and continuation of alliance system within the framework of Indo-Pacific strategy, and etc. And even for Trump, he studied Indo-Pacific strategy. Therefore, there won't be any major changes in his Indo-Pacific strategy. But the only exception would be his approach to North Korea. That can change the entire equation on the Korean Peninsula. That is the only concern we have.
Thank you, Cheng-In. I want to go to Bob Sutter and then Renato and then Dewi on this question of continuity as seen from their respective vantage points, whether country or their own analytical view. But I do want to come back, Cheng-In, before you have to leave, to one related question to continuity. Now, it is my perception as an American that we were shifting slowly, imperceptibly, but with, kind of ebb and flow, back and forth, lateral moves, effort to focus more on Asia. Our official policy documents stated that the release of an Indo-Pacific strategy, for that matter, even a Pacific strategy before any other strategy, was an indication of that. But we had two sudden surprises. One was, of course, the Ukraine war. And the second was the Middle East conflagrations that began on October 7th last year and now continue to this day. Question of second, kind of related to this continuity question. Sure, China hardening will continue. Some of the continuities in individual case country studies, case country relationships will continue. But can the attention to Asia continue if, as you say, the focus will be on making major changes in NATO, making major changes on the Ukraine war, handling the Middle East, does Asia see that there will be, under any administration, this isn't about any single administration, can the US really meet its 150-year narrative of the turn to Asia?
I doubt. Europe will be number one and Asia will be number two. I don't think that there will be any major change in that equation.
Even after the Middle East. So Asia won't be number 3, it'll be number 2, and the Middle
I
East will
think
be number 3?
Asia will be number two because of China. But again,
Because of China.
this Atlantis, alliance, which is deeply rooted in the United States, will not change easily.
Okay, thank you. I know you will have to leave, but I wanted to get your comments in before you
Thank you.
did. Thank you for joining us, Chung In, and best wishes, and we'll talk to you soon.
I'm
Bob
sorry.
Sutter. Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Bob, let me turn to you for the same questions on continuity and the related question of attention to or turn to or pivot or rebalance to Asia.
Yeah, this is a very good question, Satu. And I'm just these are my personal views, but also they're reinforced by people in Taiwan in particular who worry about these sorts of things. And I think the two things. It's basically number one is a broad trend. This is the America First movement, and what that actually means. It's active in Congress. It's growing. Trump and Vance are both seem to be proponents of this. And what they're doing is disengaging in a lot of ways, and in costly international involvements that they feel the United States shouldn't be in. And so they're doing that, and they're pushing for that in Ukraine in particular. They held up the legislation for aid to Ukraine for 6 months in the House, for example. And so I think we'll see more of that. That's not going away. I do think that the focus on China is the broad consensus in Republicans and Democrats in the Congress is definitely in line with that. And they will pursue that. But I think this also relates to what your previous panel, which talked about trade and didn't talk about why China is seen as a threat. It's widely seen as a threat in Washington, and if it's a threat, then you don't trade with a threat, but easily. That's one point, but that's a side point. The issue here is just that this consensus that you see among Republicans and Democrats, majorities in the House and the Senate, you don't see with Trump. Look at the record. Please look at the record. Trump had after COVID, he was harsh toward China. So from March until December of 2020, he was harsh toward China, and I think that was an election requirement. I'm looking for a time when Donald Trump said China is a threat. I don't think he's ever said that. I don't think he believes that. He sees China taking advantage of stupid U.S. actions. He doesn't see it as a threat. And so this is something. Look at his platform, the Republican platform. 3 mentions of China, no mention of China as a threat, and that's so different than what than Johnson's the House Speaker's speech at the House floor at the same time. He saw China as a threat here, and that's prevalent in Washington. Trump is his personal view. I'm not sure he's committed to the Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm not sure he understands strategy. I think he has I'm just not, look at the record of what he says. That's what I'm asking. And I think what you'll find, he keeps saying he's the only politician in the United States of any stature that says nice things about Xi Jinping. And he says nice things about negotiating with Xi Jinping. Like he believes that Xi Jinping can be negotiated with. That's a non-starter in Washington. Nobody trusts Xi Jinping, but he's saying things like that repeatedly. And so I'm watching this carefully. I say, the man, what is he doing here? And I think he wants to win in the trade war. That's he likes tariffs. I agree with all that. It'll be hard for China to deal with that. And he's very unpredictable. And he could be very changeable for China. But watch that. That's all I'm asking. Watch that. And I'm watching it very carefully. I've watched him 2016. Look at the record. 2020. He was harsh during the campaign, and today. And he's very much like he was in 2016. And where he never saw China as a threat in 2016. He said they're taking advantage of us. And he didn't talk in terms of threat. I'm not sure who he sees as a threat. And so I don't think he thinks that way. Whereas in Washington, the fate of the United States is seen in the balance. You see it with China. It's that kind of an existential threat. It's a threat strategically, it's a threat technology-wise, and it's a threat on governance issues. And it's just wide sense of danger coming from China. And he's over here. He's in somewhere else. And and he's the president. Now, the good news is that it's so powerful. The rest of the consensus is so powerful that he'll have a hard time doing that. It'll be he could lose politically. You know, he could push his congressional people and he'll get a lot of them to go along with him, but a lot of them I think won't. A lot of them say, damn it, this is a threat. We got to deal with this threat. You can't do this. You can't trust Xi Jinping. And if you do that, you're going to be in real trouble with us. And so I think that'll keep him under control.
Thank you for that, because that's a very important element of this issue of continuity is, of course, how much can we expect on China from either party that's elected, either candidate that's elected. There have been questions on the progressive side too about just exactly how they want to prosecute the threat from China on the Democratic side as well. Might progressives loosen up a little bit, be worried about some other things, etc. But point well taken, and we are short of time, so I do want to give some closing time to Renato and to Davey on this question of continuity. What continuities do you see, including particularly two continuities that have been worked at really hard? One is this hardening US-China strategic competition. You just heard from Bob on that, where he is and where he assesses things to be. And the other is attention to Asia. And if that matters for Philippines, I could see it would matter a lot more than what given based on Davey's comments earlier. But I would like to ask both of you in your closing remarks here, because we're at 9:31.
Okay.
And so we just want to go just 3-4 minutes over. Thank you. Please, Renato.
I just want to react to Bob. I agree with Bob. During election period, we focus on individuals. So when you look at Trump, for example, I talked with some of my friends in Washington, D.C. Trump never mentioned about the South China Sea. Again, a point to South, what's happening in South China. Whereas, of course, when you go talk to, when you look at Kamala Harris, who's been here in the Philippines, he went even to Palawan on board a Philippine Coast Guard vessel, and where, of course, she got a briefing regarding, of course, South China Sea. But after, of course, election day, once they're sworn in, that's where, of course, their individual views and opinions would be, of course, affected by their role as a president, and more importantly, of course, by state, the National Security Council, and of course, the defense. I agree with Trump. Trump basically never mentioned the fact that China is a threat, but it's Trump basically who made, I would call, I teach in my class, who made the historic decision to do away with the Kissingerian view regarding China. China is not anymore a responsible stakeholder. China is a competitor. It then came out in the national security, the White House national security policy after he came to Vietnam. This was January 2018. And of course, the Defense Department came out with a document that basically said, well, we're faced by two competitors, Russia and China. It all began during the Trump administration. And of course, it continued well into the Biden administration. He might try to cut a deal with Putin and of course Xi Jinping, but of course whether they would accept that deal or not will depend on a lot of factors. So again, the element of continuity I believe will still be there, and one element of continuity that we have not discussed, and of course, is the historic dilemma faced by Washington. What is a more important region? Asia, the Indo-Pacific region, or Europe? That would continue way into the 21st century. And this will be a decision that, of course, whoever in the White House will be there after, of course, January 2025 will have to decide which is a more important region, the Indo-Pacific or Europe. Again, this is where, of course, personal opinions would really matter. Personal view of the next president would really matter a lot. I stop here.
Thank you so much. Davey, you have the final word on this issue of continuity, and over to you.
Well, I think we need to differentiate between political statements, from the president's office, and what is really happening on the ground. That's Southeast Asia will always be relatively neglected. Even at the peak of U.S.-China rivalry, Southeast Asia is only seen by Washington from the prism of its U.S.-China rivalry as derivative of that. which we in Southeast Asia actually do not appreciate. We think that we are big enough and important enough to be taken in our own merit. But on the other hand, to be relatively ignored is fine. That means that we are not in trouble. When too much attention, that means that something is going on. Yeah. In the old days, we used to say, you would like the US to be on top, but not on top. To be within hailing call distance, but not to be breathing down our neck because that's a bit heavy. So there'll be continuity. That Chiu Yee-moon said Asia is the second priority. I think Southeast Asia is probably fourth or fifth. In Northeast Asia is probably second, but Southeast Asia is I'm not sure whether it's even in the top 5 of priority, given reading from your reports and reading from what is happening there are no studies about Southeast Asia in the United States. But at the substantive level, there's continuity. I mean, structures that are in place, the US hub and spoke, the US alliance with the Philippines getting strong and stronger, the US partnership with Vietnam, the US partnership with Indonesia, and many countries, are getting very strong. Indonesia and the US have just signed comprehensive strategic partnership. Whoever is next president, I don't think that is going to be revoked.
Right.
The US Indo-Pacific fleet is still there, and all of the other, whether they come to who will attend the East Asia Summit will matter. Whether the US Foreign Minister will attend the ASEAN Regional Forums will matter. But the infrastructure of the US foreign and security relations are already well established, regardless of what happens, at the presidential level. So there will be that continuity. As diplomat will say, we are always here. They do not always make headlines because it's the summits that attract attention. But at a substantive level, I think we are comfortable. The unreliability with the United States, that's why we are non-aligned. We don't rely on big powers to defend us. So for my friends in the Philippines, I think that, self-help is also important, and strengthening Philippines' relations with ASEAN is also important so that it is not disjointed from the regional, grouping.
Devi, thank you so much. As always, wonderful to have your perspectives on the table. Renato, thank you. Bob Sutter, partner in this report, along with Nicholas Hamasevich. As always, thank you so much for your work with the East-West Center and for joining us on this 3rd edition of the report. To the previous panel, Dr. Laura Silver, Dr. Kevin Monroe, and Dr. James Kim, who joined us earlier today, to Zoe Weaver-Lee, who coordinates all our programs. Very sincere and heartfelt thanks for arranging a somewhat complicated online program. Many different time zones, people scattered all over the world to launch 2 reports in 90 minutes. For those of you who will watch this later on our YouTube channel, please do go to the East-West Center to get the report, Asia Navigates Uncertainty and Continuity of U.S. Regional Policy in the 2024 Elections, which is this one, the 3rd edition of our effort to understand how Asia thinks about U.S.-Asia policy on the eve of our national elections, and the 2nd report on American public and elite opinion on how Asia matters at the state level in the United States. So we're trying to get Asian views, we're trying to get American views on Asia, and this is well in keeping with our mission at the East-West Center, which is to bring Asians and Americans together to do collaborative research, study, and exchange. And this is just one example of such an effort. And I want to thank those of you who joined us online tonight. Of course, all of our wonderful panelists, wishing you a happy, safe, and prosperous remainder of the year as we move towards the end of 2024 and a new year to come. Thank you so much for joining us. Good day, and look forward to seeing you at another East-West Center program. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Bob.
Thank you.
There we
Bye-bye.
there we